in 1833, Donizetti wrote a piece called Lucrezia Borgia about the Borgia family, and Lucrezia particularly, that was performed in Milan to great acclaim, and he wanted to put it on in his city where he was living at the time, of Naples. Italy was not yet a unified country. That didn't happen until 1861. So we are talking about different kingdoms, different provinces under different rule, and when he got in touch with the censors, because he had to in Naples, they took one look at the plot and said, no, sorry, a murderous plot with people being poisoned and aristocracy being ridiculed, that we won't allow that here. So he started, as often would have been the case, this was not an unusual scenario, he started to tamper with it a bit and see if he could actually make it acceptable to the censors. He never got anywhere. And as he was leaving the thoughts of doing that aside, he thought, why don't we look for a different story which might very well keep the same sort of characters and relationship between characters. We'll send it back to the librettist, the great Felice Romani, who wrote some of the great librettos of the 19th century, and he would use some of his past music for Lucrezia Borgia and rewrite some music afresh for this piece. And he was sure that this would work. After all, Lucrezia Borgia had been set in Italy. It was a little bit too close to the people who were opposing it. Whereas the plot of Dalinda was set in 3rd century Middle East, surely that was not going to be a problem. Sadly, the censors saw through that and said, no, we won't have that either. And in the process of him wheeling and dealing with it, he got another commission from Paris in 1838. Off he went to carry on other work. And in the process, he never returned to Dalinda, even though he had put quite a lot of time and thought left into it. And the manuscripts, his manuscripts, eventually were lost. They were scattered, they were lost, and never performed. Eventually, Lucrezia Borgia did have other performances, so that had a life of its own, but Dalinda never did. And certainly, for as long as I can remember, it's been a sort of footnote in the history books. Yes, he wrote this piece called Dalinda, but sadly it was all lost. Until several years ago, I mean, relatively recently, 2018-19, all the fragments of his manuscript were discovered by an academic in Italy, in basements here and there, libraries and opera companies. Luckily, she recognised them for what they were, because it wouldn't altogether have been clear, and you need an academic of great familiarity with Donizetti's manuscripts to notice what they were. She realised she had everything she needed, and she reconstructed the piece absolutely according to his original intentions. That process was finished sort of the end of 2022, and last year there was a preliminary concert performance in Berlin, i.e. literally just in concert, no staging, no physical drama, as it were, literally just a concert performance. The rights for this new edition of Dalinda, which is a proper critical edition by the best Italian publishing house of opera, Ricordi, had been obtained by a company it's sort of half Italian, half British, called Opera Co-Pro. So we are working in collaboration with them. They have the rights for 2 or 3 years, and they wanted to make sure that selected companies around the world would put this piece on. I thought I was already very lucky that she approached me and said, I know you have a track record with lesser-known Donizetti, and I'll speak to you a little bit about lesser-known Donizetti in a moment. Is it something you'd be interested in, she said. I thought we might be one of the many. What I didn't realise is that we would be the first to be staging it, and I think we should be very happy about that. So, the sort of character setup that Lucrezia Borgia and Dalinda share are a title role, a central character of a very powerful political woman who is also mother to a long-lost child who she doesn't really admit to in her present circle, but this absolutely, of course, eats away at her. And how she's going to negotiate between her public duty as a powerful leader and her private story. Lucrezia Borgia, it's well known, she had a son. She was also known as quite a murderous leader of quite a vicious family. Well, in Dalinda, set in the Third Crusade, in the Middle East, Dalinda is one of the local Middle Eastern leaders of, and obviously the Crusades involved the Christian forces from Western Europe going and trying to vie for control of that area of the world. We had the Christian leaders and the Muslim leaders. So Dalinda's long-lost son eventually in his childhood was sent off to Western Europe, and he ends up coming as a mercenary, as it were, a paid soldier on behalf of the Christian forces to the Middle East. But he has a mission. He knows that he has a long-lost mother, he has a letter, and through various machinations, political, warlike, and personal, this is a journey of them discovering each other. Interestingly enough, the mass poisoning that Lucrezia is said to have done in Italy was also a documented part of Third Crusade history. So there are such close links between these two stories that Donizetti and Romani had an absolute head start in being able to modify and mould and rewrite for the bits which needed to be different, this opera. Rewriting, sometimes under the same name, sometimes under a different libretto completely, was not an unusual thing. Donizetti did it a lot. Even 30 years later, Verdi was doing it. Sometimes only to translate something for a different country. So we all have heard of Il Trovatore. What fewer of us know is that Le Trouvère happened in Paris. It needed a little bit of rewriting because when you translate, you never end up with the same number of syllables and so forth. So that's a little bit different. Don Carlo, some of us know as Don Carlo, which is the Italian version, but it was known as Don Carlos in French, and it lost an entire act and got rejigged. And so there was that sort of scenario going on. But I think we could also look at Verdi's Jerusalem, which is often done, which is a reworking or a different version, if you like, of I Lombardi, which is also often done. Or there are various versions of I Vespri Siciliani or Les Vêpres Siciliennes. Giovanna di Guzman is one of them. This was really not an unusual state of affairs. It's just that we happened not to have Dalinda. One other thing to talk about Donizetti's output is that it's of a particular style and sensibility that was popular for much of the 19th century, and towards the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century sort of fell out of favour. It was not really to their taste. I think for various reasons music changed a lot, became on one hand a lot more realistic. Realism, verismo in Italian, became an absolute force, and therefore the slight, what was perceived as artificiality of the early 19th century was sort of rejected quite often. And really only a handful of Donizetti's 70 operas were played regularly. L'Elisir d'Amore, we've all heard of. Lucia di Lammermoor, we've all heard of. Don Pasquale, we've all heard of. But they're, funnily enough, not necessarily the best three. They're just the ones that somehow people accepted. I've spent quite a long time, and there is quite a lot of people doing so at the moment, rediscovering other pieces which are unbelievably brilliant. Dramatic, musically subtle, really great character depth. Pieces which for some reason, and quite often it's to do with difficulty of casting or other sensibilities, sort of fell off the radar and have been wonderfully rediscovered. So Lucrezia Borgia was one of them. It did not have a full-time performance history, but by the time you get to the 1950s, 60s, you have people like Richard Bonning and his wife Joan Sutherland, the great soprano, rediscovering and performing these pieces and recording these pieces for the first time. Maria Callas, obviously, and they started to revive. Now, what makes this piece special? He had always written music that had been derived from Rossini, where there were certain structures that you tended to fit into. You always, arias always happened twice, and there was always a slow aria, and then you had twice for a fast aria, and things, on the whole, action never developed through set numbers, but only through recitative, and it was all rather formulaic. And he came along and he said, no, we don't need that. We need to find ways to break open the musical language and express characters more subtly. So really, just three things to think about in this. Not only is he consistently getting rid of all those repetitions to make the drama more live, even the very final aria of Dalinda after, am I going to give this away, after the death of her son, he originally wrote 2 verses, the usual cabaletta thing. Of course, he knew that that didn't really serve the drama's purposes, and I think at various stages along the way he got rid of it entirely, but that wasn't entirely convincing because she needs to express herself in some way at the end. And then there's a little note in our score that he wrote at the bottom of the Dalinda manuscript saying, please don't do this twice, once will do, and don't make it fast, don't make it all about technique and pyrotechnics and impressive twiddles, just make it real and slow and quiet and do it once. He had already, this might sound like nothing to us now, but this was revolutionary at the time. There's one aspect I'd love to talk about. I've always been incredibly aware in later Verdi that he could write a scene where the characters on stage do not mean what they're saying, and something about the music would tell you that this was the case. It might, for example, be 2 characters who are desperately trying to size each other up and really they're really enemies, but they're being incredibly polite to each other because they don't want to give away what the other one's thinking. And there's something in the over-crafted politeness of the music that expresses that makes you absolutely know that they're not being genuine. That it's rather too polished and too polite. They're hiding their feelings. And I've always thought to myself, no, that's just a Verdian thing. Not at all. In Dalinda, we have a trio that does exactly the same thing, or rather a duet between Dalinda and her husband Achmet, where they're both, she doesn't want to say that Ildemaro is her son, he doesn't want to say that he spied on her and seen her with this man and he's sure that she's having an affair. And this came from Donizetti. It's 20, 30 years earlier than I ever thought. And it's that sort of attention to emotional and character detail that I think is going to be so special working on this opera for us over the next 6 weeks. And hopefully for you in the audience, those of you who will not be on stage, I hope you'll get a real sense of personality via some fantastic music.
che tu piangi ancora.
Gentil, voi siete